You think you already know Flash Gordon, 1980? Maybe not. Because behind this strange, flashy, and wildly unusual sci-fi movie lies a long list of behind-the-scenes facts even harder to believe than what ended up on screen. From George Lucas once wanting to turn Flash Gordon into his own major project before Star Wars, to the film's lead actor not even fully completing the role himself, everything behind this movie feels like one big mess. There are casting secrets, soundtrack surprises, and backstage drama that many fans still have no idea about even after all these years. So, what are the strangest truths Flash Gordon has been hiding for so long? In this video, I'm going to reveal the facts most people never knew about Flash Gordon. Number 1. Flash's lead actor didn't fully finish the role. It already sounds hard to believe, but this is actually one of the strangest truths behind Flash Gordon. When people see Sam J. Jones on screen with the look of a classic sci-fi hero, most naturally assume he carried that character all the way through, just like any other leading man would. But the truth was far more complicated than most viewers ever realized. During post-production, Jones got caught up in a contract dispute with producer Dino De Laurentiis, and things escalated so badly that he was no longer fully involved in finishing the film. That is when Flash Gordon fell into a situation that was both awkward and deeply Hollywood. The movie still had to be completed, but its leading man was no longer there in the way people assumed he was. As a result, parts of Flash's performance had to be patched together in different ways. Some scenes required a body double, and other parts had to be dubbed by someone else, which means the central hero audiences saw on screen was no longer entirely a seamless performance by Sam J. Jones alone. In other words, the film's biggest hero ended up becoming a character pieced together during the final stretch of production. What makes it even more interesting is that most viewers never noticed. Maybe that is because Flash Gordon was already such a bright, loud, high-energy movie that the cracks behind the scenes were hidden surprisingly well. On the surface, everything still seemed to flow smoothly. Flash still felt like Flash. The movie still pulled audiences into its strange, over-the-top world. But once you know this truth, the way you see the film almost changes. It stops being just an unusual sci-fi movie from the 1980s and starts to look like a production that had to patch itself together just to survive. And maybe that is exactly what makes this story so memorable. Because while Flash Gordon was selling audiences the image of a strong, seamless, irreplaceable hero, the truth behind the scenes was that the role itself was never completed as fully as people imagined. For a film already packed with strange choices, this is still the kind of detail that makes viewers stop and wonder just how many more crazy truths Flash Gordon was hiding all along. Number 2. George Lucas wanted Flash Gordon. Before Star Wars, there is one truth that makes a lot of people see Flash Gordon in a completely different way. This was not just another strange sci-fi movie from the 1980s. It was also tied to a major turning point in film history. Because before George Lucas created Star Wars, the hero he once wanted to launch him into outer space was not Luke Skywalker. It was Flash Gordon. That detail alone is already enough to spark curiosity, because it means that before building one of the biggest film franchises of all time, Lucas had already placed a great deal of hope in a character who had been part of American pop culture for decades. He had loved Flash Gordon for years, from the comic strips to the old serials, and he saw it as the perfect foundation for a true big-screen space adventure. At the time, Flash Gordon had everything Lucas was drawn to: a central hero, strange planets, larger-than-life conflicts, old-school adventure, and the kind of epic scale Hollywood had still not fully captured the way he wanted. But things did not go the way he hoped. Lucas tried to secure the rights from the company that controlled Flash Gordon, but he failed. And that is exactly what makes this story so memorable. Instead of letting the dream die, he did something even bolder. He built a world of his own. He took the spirit of space adventure that had first captured his imagination in Flash Gordon and expanded it into something entirely new, something bigger, broader, and unmistakably his. that project would eventually become Star Wars. That is why this is not just an interesting behind-the-scenes fact. It feels more like a twist of fate. The film George Lucas could not make ended up becoming the creative stepping stone that led him toward building an even larger cinematic empire. The more you think about it, the stranger it feels. If Lucas had actually secured the rights to Flash Gordon back then, would the world still have Star Wars as we know it today? Or would the entire history of science fiction movies have gone in a completely different direction? That question alone makes Flash Gordon far more important than its flashy and unusual surface might suggest. Number 3. Sam J. Jones refused to promote the film. This may sound like a small detail at first, but it actually points to one of the biggest problems Flash Gordon faced. For a movie that expensive, that colorful, and that ambitious, promotion was almost everything. Audiences did not just need trailers and posters. They also needed to see the film's central star out in public, doing interviews, building excitement, and making people feel like this was something worth showing up for. But the strange thing is that right when Flash Gordon needed Sam J. Jones the most, he was barely there to help sell it. The reason was his conflict with producer Dino De Laurentiis. After tensions exploded during post-production, the relationship between the two had deteriorated so badly that Jones no longer took part in promoting the movie the way a lead actor normally would. And that is where the situation became a real problem. Flash Gordon was never the kind of movie that could sell itself easily. It was too flashy, too strange, too unusual, and in some ways too over-the-top compared to the science fiction films audiences were more used to at the time. A movie like that needed a strong public face to guide viewers into its world. But instead of having its leading man out front, Flash Gordon had to go into theaters without the very person who should have been carrying a huge part of the promotional push. That made it even harder for the film to feel like a major event or a must-see adventure. According to director Mike Hodges, Jones's refusal to participate in promotion was one of the reasons the movie failed to perform the way people had hoped at the box office. What makes this detail so telling is that it shows Flash Gordon did not just struggle while it was being made. It kept taking damage even as it was getting ready to meet the public. On screen, Flash was the hero of the story. But in real life, when the movie needed someone to stand up for it, that face was almost nowhere to be found. And that is what makes it all feel even more ironic. Because sometimes a movie does not stumble just because of its story or its timing. Sometimes it stumbles because, long before it reaches the audience, it is already no longer whole enough to protect itself. Number 4. Flash Gordon was meant to launch a trilogy. This is one of those details that makes Flash Gordon feel both fascinating and a little bittersweet. Today, a lot of people remember it as a strange, colorful science fiction film that eventually found a life of its own as a later cult favorite. But in the beginning, Flash Gordon was never meant to stop at just one movie. It was once expected to be the launch point for an entire trilogy. That alone says a lot about how ambitious the project really was. The filmmakers did not see Flash Gordon as some small experiment or a one-off adventure. They saw it as a world that could keep expanding, a franchise that could have a much longer life if the first film succeeded. In other words, Flash Gordon was meant to be an opening chapter, not a one-time shot. But this is where the story took a very different turn. The problems involving Sam J. Jones during post-production, combined with the film's disappointing box office performance, all but killed any real hope for a sequel. The bigger plan people once had in mind disappeared almost overnight. Instead of becoming the first chapter in a long-running series, Flash Gordon ended up standing alone as a single film that was stylish, strange, memorable, and impossible to ignore, but unable to go any further. What makes this detail stand out is that it gives Flash Gordon the feeling of a world that was left unfinished. When you watch the film again, you can feel that its scale, color, and ambition were much bigger than a story that was only meant to be told once. And that is exactly why this fact lingers. Because if things had gone just a little differently, Flash Gordon might not have remained simply a weird standalone movie from the 1980s. It might have grown into a major franchise that lasted for years. Number 5. Sam J. Jones was discovered on a dating show. If you only look at Sam J. Jones in Flash Gordon, you would probably assume he discovered the usual Hollywood way. He auditioned, got cast, and became the face of a major studio film. But the real story was much stranger. The person who first helped put Jones on the radar for Flash was not a famous casting director or a filmmaker searching for a new star. It was producer Dino De Laurentiis's mother-in-law after she saw him on The Dating Game. That detail alone gives this story exactly the kind of weird energy that seems to follow Flash Gordon everywhere. The idea that the lead actor in a major science fiction movie was spotted on a dating show sounds more like something made up than a real behind-the-scenes fact, but that is exactly what happened. At the time, Sam J. Jones had the bright, clean-cut look, the athletic build, and the classic all-American leading man appeal that made De Laurentiis believe he could fit into the exaggerated, colorful comic book world of Flash Gordon. What makes it even more interesting is that Jones's road to the role was not short or easy. Even after getting noticed, he still had to go through a long audition process before he was finally cast. So that television appearance was not an instant ticket to the part, but it was the moment that opened the biggest door of his career. For many viewers, Sam J. Jones will always be the face of Flash Gordon. And when you think about it, that makes the story even stranger, because the path that brought him there did not begin on a film set or in an acting class. It began on a dating show. Number 6. Kurt Russell rejected Flash as too thin. Before Sam J. Jones was cast, Dino De Laurentiis reportedly saw Kurt Russell as the ideal face for Flash Gordon. At that point, Russell already had strong screen presence, a masculine edge, and the kind of confidence that fit a central action hero perfectly. On the surface, he seemed like a near-perfect choice. But what makes it interesting is that Kurt Russell did not see the character the same way. He turned the role down because he felt Flash Gordon was too thin as a character, not layered enough to really hold his interest. In other words, Russell was not just looking at the chance to headline a big movie. He was also looking at whether the character gave him enough to work with. And for him, the answer was no. That detail alone says a lot about Flash Gordon. The film had a huge world, a bold visual style, and a lot of ambition, but at the very center of it all, the lead character may not have felt strong enough to convince an actor like Kurt Russell. Looking back, that is what makes it so fascinating. If he had taken the role, the entire feeling of the movie might have gone in a very different direction. Number 7. Arnold lost Flash over his accent. Just imagining Arnold Schwarzenegger stepping into the world of Flash Gordon already feels strange enough. A physical, overpowering screen presence like Arnold, with that unmistakable energy, would have given the movie a completely different vibe if he had actually become Flash. And what makes it even more interesting is that this is not just some fan-made what-if. Arnold really was considered for the role. At the time, he had the exact kind of look that fit the comic book hero image the film was chasing. He was tall, powerful, striking, and almost made for a world as exaggerated as Flash Gordon. But the issue was that the movie needed more than the right body type. It also needed a face and a voice that could carry the role, lead the audience through the story, and make them fully believe in that central hero. And that is where Arnold ran into trouble. The reason he was not chosen came down to his very distinctive Austrian accent. At the time, the filmmakers felt that voice did not fit the all-American hero image they wanted for Flash Gordon. And just like that, one detail was enough to change the entire direction of the casting. Sometimes actors do not lose roles because they look wrong or lack screen presence. Sometimes it comes down to one small thing that becomes impossible to ignore the moment they start speaking. And for Arnold, it was his voice that kept him from becoming Flash Gordon. Number 8. Queen. Nearly missed the soundtrack. Today, If people think of Flash Gordon, a lot of them immediately think of Queen's soundtrack as something inseparable from the movie itself. The music is so big, so dramatic, and such a perfect match for the film's bright, exaggerated world. It does not just sit alongside the visuals. It almost lifts the entire atmosphere of the movie to another level. But what makes it so interesting is that the pairing now seems so perfect, and yet it almost never happened. At first, producer Dino De Laurentiis did not even really know who Queen was. Based on the stories that have been told, his reaction when the band's name was brought up was almost one of genuine surprise. That means the group that would later become so deeply tied to the soul of Flash Gordon was not an obvious choice from the beginning. If the people around him had not pushed for it, the movie might have ended up going in a completely different musical direction. Number 9. Ming's costume was too heavy to sit in. Just looking at Ming and Flash Gordon is enough to understand what the filmmakers were going for. From the costume to the headpiece to his entire presence, everything was pushed hard to make sure Ming looked powerful the moment he appeared on screen. And it worked. In the movie, he feels both extravagant and intimidating, almost taking over the frame every time he shows up. But that look came at a real cost. Max von Sydow's costume was so heavy and cumbersome that between takes, he could not even sit down and rest normally. Instead, he had to lie on a board while waiting for the next scene. That detail alone says a lot about just how extreme Flash Gordon's costume design really was. What makes this story so interesting is that it shows exactly how far the movie was willing to go to create its own world. Flash Gordon was never interested in doing anything halfway. It wanted its villain to feel huge, theatrical, and unforgettable, and Ming's costume was a big part of that. For the audience, it looked impressive. But for the actor wearing it under hot studio lights for hours, it was clearly more than just a performance. It was something he had to physically endure. And in the end, it was those kinds of extreme choices that gave the film its unmistakable look. Number 10. Brian Blessed made his own battle sounds. This is the kind of detail that feels completely in line with the spirit of Flash Gordon. Brian Blessed was already a huge burst of energy every time he appeared, and when he stepped into the role of Vulton, he pushed everything even further. He was not just acting through his voice, expressions, or movement. He got so into the part that during one battle scene, he actually started making pew-pew sound effects with his own mouth while filming. It sounds funny, but it really happened. And of course, it threw the scene off because those sounds were never part of the plan. But that small moment also says a lot about the kind of performer Brian Blessed was. He did not walk into Flash Gordon with restraint or subtlety. He threw himself into it with full excitement. And maybe that is exactly why his character is still one of the most unforgettable parts of the movie. Number 11. Batman's writer shaped the film's campy tone. If Flash Gordon feels both serious and intentionally over the top, like a space adventure mixed with a comic book brought to life, that was not by accident. A big part of that tone came from Lorenzo Semple Jr., one of the key writers behind the 1960s Batman television series. He was exactly the kind of writer who understood the appeal of bold, colorful, slightly outrageous comic book storytelling. So when he came to Flash Gordon, Semple did not try to turn it into a heavy or overly serious science fiction film. He kept the fun, the theatricality, and the clear sense of exaggeration in the writing. And that is exactly why the movie feels so different from many other films of its time. It does not hide how strange it is. It almost embraces that strangeness from the very beginning. Number 12. Flash Gordon inspired. Thor: Ragnarok. What is interesting about Flash Gordon is that the film did not disappear the way many people once assumed it would. It may not have become a major blockbuster when it first came out, but its very specific style lasted much longer than that. The bright colors, the playful tone, and the slightly wild, exaggerated sense of space adventure stayed in the minds of more than a few filmmakers who came later. One of the clearest examples is Thor: Ragnarok. Director Taika Waititi has openly said that Flash Gordon influenced him, especially in its color, energy, and the way it treated adventure without taking itself too seriously. And that is what makes this detail so great. A film once seen as too strange, too loud, and too colorful eventually became part of the inspiration behind a modern Marvel blockbuster. It really makes you realize that some movies do not win right away when they are first released. They win in a different way. They stay around long enough to shape the people who come after them. Number 13. Finding Flash. Took 10 months. The search for Flash Gordon alone says a lot about how carefully this movie was being put together. The filmmakers were not just looking for a handsome actor or someone with a strong physical presence. They needed a face who could stand at the center of a world that was wildly exaggerated, colorful, and unusual, and still make audiences believe he belonged at the heart of it. And to find that person, the casting process lasted 10 months. That may sound simple, but that length of time shows just how hard the role was to cast. Flash had to feel like a classic hero while also fitting naturally into a movie that looked unlike almost anything else being made at the time. In the end, Sam J. Jones got the part. And even though the film later ran into all kinds of problems, that long casting process alone shows that Flash Gordon was never a careless project. From the beginning, it was something the filmmakers took very seriously. If Flash Gordon is still one of those unforgettable movie memories for you, hit like, subscribe, and join us as we keep uncovering Hollywood's strangest behind-the-scenes stories.